The 1,970 seconds were a strange and dangerous time for science fiction. The genre was no longer confined to campy space adventures or plastic aliens. Instead, it began to evolve into something far more unsettling: stories that questioned identity, government, perception, and reality itself. And yet, as this creative explosion unfolded, something equally curious was happening behind the scenes. Some films, bold, confrontational, and uncomfortably accurate, were suddenly no longer sci-fi. Studios and distributors began pushing them under safer, vaguer labels: thriller, psychological drama, fantasy, even romance. Not because they weren't science fiction, but because they were too science fiction, too predictive, too close to home, too threatening to the status quo. In some cases, entire marketing campaigns were redesigned to mislead audiences. In others, directors were pressured to re-edit or omit key futuristic elements. Sci-fi wasn't banned, it was rebranded. Today, these films stand like quiet monuments to an era when genre wasn't just creative, it was political. Rewatch them, and you'll notice the strange technologies, the experiments in perception, the subtle dystopias buried beneath emotional arcs or character studies. These weren't misclassified by accident, they were strategically erased from the genre they helped expand. And now, decades later, we return to them not just as lost films, but as muted prophecies, finally heard. This is Vaulted Futures, and here are 15 films that were once science fiction until Hollywood said they weren't. Number 1. Stalker, 1979. When Stalker was exported abroad, most distributors avoided the phrase science fiction altogether. They called it philosophical drama, art film, existential parable. Anything to dodge the implication that Tarkovsky had created one of the purest sci-fi visions of the century. But the truth is unavoidable. Stalker is a film built entirely on speculative architecture. Set in the aftermath of a mysterious cosmic event, the film follows three men navigating a restricted zone, governed by invisible forces and shifting physical laws. It is a world altered by something beyond human comprehension. Gravity misbehaves. Objects move without touch. Desire shapes reality. The zone is not metaphor, it is scientific anomaly, environmental mutation, a landscape where physics bends to consciousness. Yet distributors feared the sci-fi label. They worried audiences would expect lasers or spaceships rather than a meditative journey into unknowability. They feared political scrutiny as well. Any Soviet film about forbidden zones and government secrecy risked misinterpretation. So Stalker was stripped of its genre, disguised as poetic introspection. Today, it stands as one of the most influential works in speculative cinema. A film about faith, entropy, and the quiet terror of a world altered by forces we cannot measure. A masterpiece reclassified not because it lacked science fiction, but because it embodied it too powerfully. Number 2. Dead Ringers, Etusin, Onihundrel, a Oteophius. David Cronenberg's Dead Ringers was marketed as a disturbing psychological drama about twin gynecologists spiraling into obsession and decay. But that label mutates the truth. Beneath its surgical calm lies one of the most unsettling science fiction concepts of the 1,980 seconds, so grounded and clinical that the studio refused to acknowledge it. The film revolves around identical twins who develop specialized medical tools for experimenting on women they believe are physiologically abnormal. These instruments, grotesque and elegantly engineered, feel like prototypes from an alternate biotech timeline. They exist in a space between science and nightmare, where medical innovation turns inward, twisting into obsession and mutation. Cronenberg's exploration of bodily alteration, experimental anatomy, and technological perversion is classic speculative fiction. Yet the distributors deliberately distanced the film from sci-fi, positioning it instead as high-end psychological horror. They feared that labeling it science fiction would invite backlash from both medical communities and audiences uncomfortable with its surgical precision. Viewed now, Dead Ringers is unmistakably sci-fi at its core, a study of technology as pathology, innovation as disease. A world where the boundaries of the body become malleable under the pressure of genius and madness. Its reclassification wasn't artistic, it was protective. A shield against a film that understood too much about how the future might hurt. Number 3. Solaris 1972, Tarkovsky. When Solaris reached Western distributors, its identity was already fractured. Instead of presenting it as a science fiction masterpiece equal to 2001, A Space Odyssey, studios labeled it metaphysical drama, psychological cinema, even spiritual allegory, anything but sci-fi. Tarkovsky's refusal to indulge in hardware or spectacle allowed studios to bury its speculative nature under philosophical packaging. But Solaris is profoundly science fiction. Its premise, a sentient planet capable of generating physical manifestations from human memory, is one of the most advanced speculative concepts ever filmed. The station's isolation, the planet's biological intelligence, the looping of memories into material forms, all of it sits at the core of the genre. Yet American distributors feared the term sci-fi would mislead audiences into expecting something sleek and futuristic. The result was a deliberate reclassification that distanced the film from its own DNA. Critics at the time debated whether the film was even genre fiction at all, but Tarkovsky understood that the most powerful science fiction doesn't rely on gadgets. It interrogates the human mind under extreme conditions. Solaris does exactly that. A cosmic intelligence forces its characters to confront private grief, suppressed regret, and illusions of identity, turning scientific exploration into psychological dissection. Revisit it now, and its science fiction core becomes unmistakable, a sentient ocean studying us with more precision than any machine ever could, a station collapsing under the weight of memory made flesh, a film reclassified not because it failed as sci-fi, but because it exceeded every expectation of what sci-fi was allowed to be. Number 4. The Accidental Tourist, 1988. At first glance, The Accidental Tourist looks like a conventional drama about grief, travel, and emotional recovery. That's exactly how the studio wanted audiences to see it. But its quiet detachment, uncanny shifts in tone, and the strange way its characters navigate an increasingly artificial world reveals something more speculative beneath its polite exterior. The protagonist writes travel guides designed to help people avoid surprise, discomfort, or unpredictability manuals that aim to mechanize human experience. Through his eyes, the world becomes structured, sanitized, and eerily standardized. Neighborhoods blend together, cultures flatten, differences evaporate. It feels like a proto-speculative critique of a reality engineered for convenience rather than authenticity. Several early drafts leaned further into speculative territory, exploring themes of emotional automation, behavioral algorithms, and the technologization of human routine. But the studio steered the final cut toward prestige drama, distancing it from anything resembling science fiction. The sci-fi tag would have undermined the film's awards ambitions. Watch the film now, and its speculative edges become impossible to ignore. A world where emotion is systematized. A life lived by algorithm decades before algorithms ruled everything. A drama only on the surface while beneath it. A futuristic anxiety simmers quietly, unacknowledged, and deliberately unclassified. Number 5. The Man Who Fell to Earth, 1976. When Nicholas Roeg's The Man Who Fell to Earth premiered, it baffled studios, critics, and audiences. Its star, David Bowie, appeared otherworldly. Its imagery was fragmented and hypnotic, and its ideas about surveillance, addiction, alien assimilation, and technological stagnation were unmistakably science fiction. Yet the studio pushed it as avant-garde drama instead of leaning into its speculative architecture. On paper, the film is about an alien who comes to Earth seeking water for his dying planet. But Roeg sidesteps conventional storytelling in favor of fractured time, memory distortions, and nonlinear identity decay. The studio, uncomfortable with the alien narrative's bleak implications, instead emphasized themes of celebrity, seduction, and emotional detachment. Posters downplayed the extraterrestrial premise. Trailers highlighted melodrama instead of technology. Roeg himself admitted the film's science fiction core was diluted in marketing to avoid genre expectations. Executives feared that calling it sci-fi would invite scrutiny over its political implications, corporate monopolies, technological suppression, and the weaponization of innovation. Decades later, The Man Who Fell to Earth stands as one of the most sophisticated sci-fi films of its era, one Hollywood tried to disguise because it demanded too much clarity from viewers. It is a film about an alien losing his mission, and a studio losing its nerve. Number 6. The Reflecting Skin, 1990. When The Reflecting Skin was released, it was labeled as art house horror, A surreal coming-of-age tale, a dark rural fable. Anything, really, except what it truly resembles. A bleak piece of speculative fiction disguised beneath mythic symbolism. The studio avoided the sci-fi label because it clashed with the film's gothic aesthetic, but its underlying narrative quietly intersects with the genre in ways that disturb more than any creature or ghost. The story unfolds in a desolate post-war American landscape, where a young boy begins to believe a local widow is a vampire. But beneath that surface myth lies something stranger, a world affected by fallout, radiation, mutations, and an atmosphere thick with unseen contamination. Characters fall ill without explanation. Skin pales unnaturally. Bodies deteriorate in ways the film never explicitly names. The vampire interpretation becomes a distraction from something more scientific, more systemic, lurking just outside of frame. Early production drafts leaned into environmental collapse and post-atomic anxieties, but distributors insisted on a symbolic approach that reclassified the film as psychological allegory. Anything resembling speculative commentary, radiation sickness, genetic distortion, environmental poisoning was intentionally downplayed. Seen today, the reflecting skin feels like a rural sci-fi nightmare filtered through a fever dream, a world poisoned by forces too large for its characters to understand. A warning rebranded as folklore, not because it was unclear, but because it was too clear. Number 7. The Truman Show, 1998. When The Truman Show arrived, it was called satire, comedy, social allegory, anything but science fiction. Paramount deliberately avoided the label despite the film's technological backbone, a man raised inside a fully artificial world, controlled by omnipresent surveillance, environmental simulation, and behavioral manipulation. Christoph's dome is not metaphor, it is engineered reality. Artificial weathers, remote-controlled extras, a broadcast system that predicts and structures human behavior. These concepts are not comedic, they are speculative models of future media control. Yet the studio insisted on selling it as quirky and conceptual, not sci-fi. The term science fiction never appeared in its primary marketing. Some insiders claimed executives feared the sci-fi label would make audiences expect spaceships or dystopias. Others believed the story's predictive accuracy, reality TV, surveillance culture, algorithmic manipulation was too sharp, too truthful, too close to society's trajectory. Today, The Truman Show plays like a prophetic blueprint, a film that saw the rise of constant observation and curated reality years before they became normal. Its reclassification wasn't about accuracy, it was about cushioning impact. It predicted the world we live in, and Hollywood responded by pretending it was never science fiction at all. Number 8. Ordinary People, 1980. No one calls Ordinary People a science fiction film, and the studio made sure of that. Marketed as a prestige family drama, the film swept the Oscars and secured its place in cinematic history. But its original script and early concept drafts contained speculative elements later removed or reorganized to fit a more traditional awards season narrative. The story of a suburban family fractured by trauma feels intimate and grounded, but the film's structure, its temporal distortions, memory manipulation, and the subtle suggestion that perception can be altered beyond emotional truth aligns more closely with speculative storytelling than most admit. Early production notes referenced experimental therapy techniques that bordered on neurological intervention, though these were later minimized. Some film scholars argue that the way the narrative fractures time, distorts memory, and blurs emotional reality into physical consequence is quietly speculative. Paramount, however, sought a film that could compete in drama categories, not one that risked confusion or controversy by leaning into its sci-fi undertones. Viewed today, Ordinary People feels like a what-if scenario rendered so gently the audience doesn't notice the genre beneath it. A film that engineered its emotional architecture with precision and then was reclassified to hide the machinery under the floorboards. Number 9. Jacob's Ladder, 1990. When Jacob's Ladder premiered, TriStar Pictures refused to categorize it as science fiction. Instead, they framed it as psychological horror, a trauma study, a fever dream. But beneath its fractured images and disorienting visions lies a narrative grounded in speculative experimentation, one the studio quietly avoided highlighting. The film follows a Vietnam veteran haunted by memories that shift like unstable molecules, time fractures, street scenes twist into alternate versions of themselves. People morph, then reappear unchanged. Reality feels infected. While marketed as surrealism, the film's backbone is scientific, an alleged military experiment involving hallucinogenic neurochemicals designed to alter perception, cognition, and emotional processing. Early scripts lean deeper into its speculative roots, but the studio requested changes to maintain interpretive ambiguity. They wanted audiences to wonder whether it was supernatural or psychological, not technological. A science fiction label, they feared, would make the controversy too explicit, especially when whispers circulated about real-life testing during wartime. With its shifting realities and chemically induced alternate states, Jacob's Ladder is unmistakably sci-fi. But the studio recategorized it to protect the film from political scrutiny. What remains is a masterpiece masquerading as madness, a speculative warning disguised as nightmare logic. Number 10. The Rapture, 1991. The Rapture is one of the strangest films of the early 90s, bold, confrontational, and spiritually apocalyptic. Yet when it premiered, New Line Cinema refused to call it science fiction, labeling it instead a religious drama. But its final act leaves no doubt. This is speculative cinema with cosmic stakes. The film begins as a grounded character study about a woman trapped in a cycle of nihilism and spiritual searching. But as the story unfolds, the world around her begins to shift subtly at first, then violently toward an eschatological scenario that defies natural law. Visions, transformations, breaches in reality, and an ending that feels less like metaphor than literal cosmic intervention. Critics who saw early cuts noted its unsettling blend of theology and sci-fi speculation, yet the studio feared alienating both religious and secular audiences. So they stripped the film of its genre identity, insisting it was strictly metaphysical drama. Today, The Rapture feels like an unacknowledged precursor to films that mix spiritual myth with speculative structure, works like The Leftovers, Under the Skin, or Annihilation. It is a film that crossed genre boundaries so boldly that Hollywood responded by erasing them altogether. Number 11. Safe, 1995. On paper, Todd Haynes' Safe is a psychological drama about a woman suffering from environmental illness. But beneath its varnish of ambiguity lies one of the most chilling pieces of speculative fiction of the 1990 seconds, so subtle that the studio refused to call it science fiction at all. The film follows a suburban woman who develops sudden hypersensitivity to chemicals, radiation, and modern life itself. Symptoms escalate without explanation. Doctors are useless. Technology becomes an invisible predator. The world, sterile and artificial, begins to poison her simply by existing. When the film premiered, distributors marketed it strictly as drama, avoiding any suggestion that it might be sci-fi. But viewed through a contemporary lens, Safe predicts the anxieties of the 21st century with unnerving accuracy: environmental collapse, toxic consumerism, micropollutants, and the psychological breakdown caused by overexposure to modernity. Haynes himself described it as a horror film without monsters, but critics quickly recognized the speculative subtext, a world evolving too quickly for the human body to adapt. In another timeline, Safe would be discussed alongside Gattaca or Stalker. Instead, it was quietly reclassified to avoid controversy. It is science fiction hiding under the clinical white light of everyday life. Number 12. Brainstorm, 1983. It was supposed to be the next great leap in cinematic science fiction, a film about a device that records human consciousness with absolute precision. But after production difficulties, the death of Natalie Wood, and studio anxiety over the film's implications, Brainstorm became something else entirely. MGM pushed it as a technological thriller instead of the bold sci-fi meditation it actually is. The film follows a team of researchers who develop a system capable of capturing not just sights and sounds, but sensory experience itself. Emotions, memories, fear, death, digitized and replayable. It is pure speculative audacity, the kind of idea that would later fuel cyberpunk. But MGM feared the sci-fi label would overshadow the tragedy surrounding the production or draw unwanted scrutiny to its more controversial themes: surveillance, military appropriation, and ethical corruption. So they softened it. They hid it behind a facade of drama and intrigue. The marketing focused on characters rather than concept. The posters ignored the device entirely. Even the trailers avoided framing it as science fiction. Yet, when viewed today, Brainstorm feels like a blueprint for technologies we're now inching toward: neural mapping, sensory archives, digital consciousness preservation. It was ahead of its time, and Hollywood responded by disguising it. Not because it wasn't sci-fi, but because it was too close to becoming real. Number 13. The Lathe of Heaven, 1980, PBS TV movie. Broadcast once, then buried. The Lathe of Heaven is perhaps one of the clearest examples of a sci-fi film stripped of its own genre, and that may have been deliberate. Based on Ursula K. Le Guin's novel, the story follows a man whose dreams change reality literally. Each time he sleeps, the world rewrites itself, and only he remembers the previous versions. It's a concept that blends quantum physics, metaphysics, and existential terror, pure speculative gold. But when PBS aired it, they downplayed the sci-fi element, marketing it as a philosophical drama. The low-budget visuals and lack of commercial release made it easy to dismiss as an oddity rather than a high-concept thought experiment. Studio memos suggested concerns that audiences would be confused or disengaged by the sci-fi tag, so it was recontextualized as something quieter, softer. Even Le Guin was reportedly frustrated by the soft sell approach. Today, The Lathe of Heaven is a cult artifact, but for years, it was shelved not for quality but for classification. A film that literally rewrote reality was quietly rewritten itself. Number 14. The Swimmer, 1968. At first glance, The Swimmer seems like a strange fable or surreal allegory. A man in swimming trunks decides to swim home through the backyard pools of his wealthy neighbors. No sci-fi, right? Except, what if it is? Though based on a short story by John Cheever, the film plays like speculative fiction. As the protagonist drifts from pool to pool, time fractures. Seasons shift in an afternoon. Relationships blur. People remember him differently. He remembers less. Reality unravels not with spectacle, but with quiet dislocation. Columbia Pictures marketed The Swimmer as psychological drama, but many scholars now argue it functions as covert science fiction, a meditation on memory distortion, temporal loops, and identity collapse. It's Solaris, but without the spaceship. There were rumors of alternate endings, scrapped voiceovers, and reshoots that pushed it further from its speculative roots. Whether intentional or not, The Swimmer became one of the earliest examples of sci-fi in denial, a genre film gaslit into respectability. This isn't just a drama about a man in crisis. It's a collapsing timeline masquerading as a character study. Number 15. Seconds, 1966. Before dystopia was sleek or digital, it was organic, fleshy, surgical, and disturbingly quiet. Seconds is one of those films that never wore its sci-fi label proudly, not because it didn't belong there, but because it belonged there too much. The story centers on a middle-aged man offered a second life, new face, new identity, new future, through an elite and ominous medical agency. What follows is not a thriller, though that's how it was marketed. It's a slow-burning psychological autopsy on the idea of human upgrade. What happens when technology tampers not with machines, but with the soul? Upon release, Seconds was labeled drama or psychological horror, but its core is undeniably science fiction, an eerie forecast of elective identity reconstruction, body modification, and privatized reinvention. The surgical procedures depicted were speculative for the time, yet mirror present-day cosmetic transformations almost exactly. Paramount allegedly avoided the sci-fi label to dodge audience expectations of gadgets or space. Instead, they sold a film about existential dread, but in doing so, they buried one of the most disturbing visions of near-future biopolitics. Seconds wasn't rebranded by accident. It was repackaged to make its dark prophecies harder to detect. Bonus fact: Until the End of the World, 1991. Before the world was saturated with screens, recordings, and digital echoes of the self, Wim Wenders imagined a future where images weren't entertainment, they were narcotics. Until the End of the World was marketed as a romantic, globe-spanning drama, a wandering road movie with a philosophical bent. But beneath its sprawling runtime lies a speculative concept so bold, so disturbingly prescient, that the studio downplayed it almost entirely. At the center of the story is an experimental device capable of recording what the human eye sees and later, what the human mind dreams. a technology originally designed to restore sight morphs into something far more dangerous, a machine that feeds its users endless loops of their own subconscious. Characters become addicted not to drugs, but to visions of themselves. They watch their dreams on repeat until identity dissolves. The film predicts a world in which images become the ultimate seduction, self-surveillance as a private obsession. Warner Brothers, uncertain how to market a 5-hour speculative epic, pivoted away from the sci-fi label. Trailers highlighted romance instead of technology. Posters ignored the neural recording device entirely. The theatrical cut was trimmed into something unrecognizable, reducing its speculative weight and burying its warnings about digital isolation, mediated perception, and the psychological quicksand of constant self-reflection. But the full version released later, largely unpromoted, is unmistakably science fiction. It's a map of the future drawn before GPS existed, a meditation on digital addiction before smartphones, a vision of self-recording technology before personal cameras were ubiquitous. And like many prophetic works, it was hidden in plain sight. Some films don't just disappear, they vanish for a reason. Every film on this list carries the same quiet truth. Genre isn't just a label, it's a boundary. And when a story crosses that boundary too boldly, when it predicts too much, reveals too much, or reflects the future too clearly, Hollywood has always found ways to rename it, soften it, or bury it beneath something safer. But time has a way of restoring identity. Rewatch these films now, and their speculative bones surface instantly, unmistakably, no matter what the posters once claimed. So here's the question. Which of these reclassified sci-fi films do you think deserve to keep its true identity, and which one feels more prophetic today than ever?